At 7:00 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, while most of Britain remained wrapped in weekend stillness, a leaked internal memo surfaced unexpectedly in the politics section of the Times. Not the tabloids, not the royal gossip columns, but a page typically reserved for strategic dispatches from the Foreign Office or high-level government briefings. Scrawled in slightly smudged ink, the handwritten note contained a chilling phrase: clear and deliberate, Meghan may be the most destructive royal in modern history. Within 4 hours, what began as a vague excerpt exploded across the global press. Major outlets BBC Sky News, The Guardian picked up the phrase most destructive royal ever without question, marks without attribution. No one confirmed its authenticity, but no one denied it either. It was treated not as a rumor, but as a declaration cloaked in royal silence. What made this different was the historical weight it carried. Meghan wasn't merely being criticized, she was being placed alongside the darkest chapters of the monarchy: the abdication of Edward VIII, the explosive divorce of Diana and Charles, and the criminal allegations surrounding Prince Andrew. She, a woman who held no constitutional power, was now accused of triggering a crisis on par with the most destabilizing moments in royal history. It wasn't just the message, it was how it was delivered. There was no official palace statement, no rebuttal, no clarification, just an echo chamber of prestigious outlets amplifying a phrase that clearly didn't originate from media speculation. As one senior BBC correspondent noted, this doesn't feel like a media frenzy. It feels like strategic disclosure from the palace, carefully placed and intentionally unchallenged. By midday, the hashtag worst royal ever had gone global, and as if on cue, Meghan was photographed walking along a quiet Montecito trail, dressed in sleek, athleisure sunglasses on water bottle in hand. The photos, distributed by a known PR-aligned agency, seemed designed to project calm resilience, but online reactions were brutal. Critics accused her of being tone-deaf, calculated, and performing serenity. A gesture meant to convey strength instead fueled the narrative of manipulation. Yet among journalists, the real story wasn't Meghan's response, it was the palace's silence. Their refusal to comment wasn't passive, it was tactical. In the 24 hours that followed, a wave of background briefings began to surface stories about Meghan being difficult to work with, reminders of staff resignations, resurfaced headlines calling her Duchess difficult. This wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. Bit by bit, a portrait was being painted Meghan, not just disruptive in the media, but corrosive to the very structure of the monarchy. And Harry nowhere to be found. No joint statement, no paparazzi shots, no podcast appearances. His silence was louder than words and deeply uncharacteristic. Royal observers began to speculate. Had he been advised to stay quiet? Was there internal conflict? Or had he finally chosen not to escalate what was clearly becoming a coordinated takedown? But what the cameras didn't catch was what Meghan did next, a discreet move that would trigger the palace's next strike in the silent war. What the cameras missed, insiders did not. According to a senior former staffer who spoke under condition of anonymity, Meghan's response to the viral most destructive royal ever label wasn't simply a walk in Montecito, it was a flurry of phone calls, emails, and damage control meetings. Within hours of the headline dominating the news cycle, a controlled media push began. Inspirational quotes quietly uploaded to her lifestyle brand's channels, a soft-filtered video teaser on truth and healing filmed in a sun-drenched garden, and strategic appearances of friends sharing old flattering memories online. But this wasn't the first time damage control had followed internal chaos. For those who once worked inside the Sussexes' orbit, especially during the height of their time at Frogmore Cottage, the pattern was all too familiar. According to testimony from 3 former palace staffers, the label difficult didn't emerge from thin air. It was built on months of documented tension, resignations, and unreported HR complaints. One former aide, now working in the private sector, stated flatly, "There were days when junior staff would cry in the loo, not because of media pressure, but because of internal expectations that no one could survive." While the public narrative often painted Meghan as a victim of a hostile institution, these insiders began to paint a darker mirror. An email leaked to the Daily Telegraph, reportedly from a mid-level operations manager, outlined a now infamous meeting in 2019, where a staffer was allegedly reprimanded for proposing a charity schedule that gave equal visibility to both Harry and Meghan. The alleged directive, all programming must support the Duchess's voice, as central to the Sussex message. It was a chilling echo of a new kind of protocol, one that clashed with the palace's long-standing ethos of unity and institutional modesty. The idea that a royal initiative could be restructured not to serve the cause, but to serve one individual's public narrative, was unprecedented, and it rattled those within the system. A second source confirmed the internal shift. Meetings became less about the work and more about managing mood optics and who felt marginalized that day. And it wasn't just hearsay. From the infamous Duchess Difficult headlines to the behind-the-scenes complaints quietly registered with HR, a pattern of dysfunction began to take root, fueled further by the palace's apparent unwillingness to publicly defend either side. Instead, they allowed the narrative to evolve slowly but surely, letting public perception bake into legacy. But things took a sharper turn following the Oprah interview and later the Netflix docuseries. These weren't just explosive PR events, they were seen internally as breaches of a centuries-old unwritten code. Never explain, never complain. For palace traditionalists, Meghan's willingness to publicly air grievances wasn't merely disruptive. It was seen as a violation of sacred protocol, one that unstitched the very fabric holding the institution together. Meanwhile, William and Kate's consistent disciplined appearances, cheerfully hosting children's events, attending national memorials, shaking hands in Wales, stood in stark contrast. Palace advisors began quietly reinforcing a dichotomy in the press: stability versus chaos, discretion versus disruption. And that contrast worked. The public didn't need to be told where to look, only shown. By letting the silence persist and the headlines speak for themselves, the palace had subtly shifted the narrative from defense to framing. Meghan was no longer just controversial, she was disruptive to the crown. And then came the leak that changed everything. An email with a digital signature buried for years suddenly surfaced, threatening to dismantle the very version of events Meghan had fought to protect. The leaked email hit like a thunderclap. Dated March 2020 and digitally signed through a secure internal channel used exclusively for high-level royal correspondence, the document was never meant to see daylight. Its content was simple, just 5 lines, but the implications were devastating. In it, Meghan expressed to a senior palace aide that she felt increasingly isolated and unsupported, stating she had raised concerns about internal hostility and had requested a temporary step back from public duties to preserve mental and organizational stability. The most explosive part, that final sentence: "If stepping back ensures long-term cohesion and preserves trust within the household, I am willing to do so quietly and without public statement." The email, buried for years, shattered the dominant assumption that Meghan had always intended to wage a public campaign against the monarchy. Instead, it suggested a critical inversion that she had at one point sought discretion, compromise, and an off-ramp from confrontation. Within hours of the leak, the online conversation flipped. Phrases like optics over empathy and the firm's internal silencing machine trended on X, formerly Twitter, while media outlets scrambled to reframe previous stories that had depicted Meghan as orchestrating her exit. Commentators began dissecting the timeline. If such an offer had been made and ignored, why had the institution continued to allow the narrative of rebellion and betrayal to fester? Some speculated the email had been leaked from Meghan's team, a calculated countermove to the most destructive royal ever campaign, but forensic metadata told a different story. Cyber analysts confirmed the document had originated from an internal archive previously accessible only to senior palace staff and had passed through a media intermediary known for subtle coordination with royal communication offices. This wasn't a Sussex move, it was a palace fracture. And then came the second twist, in a previously unseen recording from 2021, shared in a behind-the-scenes clip from the Netflix docuseries but never aired. Harry can be heard discussing the moment he learned of the label destructive. His voice, though calm, cracks slightly. They want her to break, not publicly, but inside, where she can't push back. The line, now widely circulated, added emotional texture to what had been seen as a purely strategic conflict. The irony was sharp. While Meghan had been vilified for speaking too much, her early request to remain silent and step away had apparently been dismissed or worse, buried to make room for a cleaner narrative, one in which the system remained the victim and she the aggressor. But this revelation came at a steep cost. Rather than vindicate Meghan outright, the leak reignited debate over whether internal power plays between advisors, between brothers, between factions within the palace had used her as both pawn and scapegoat. The institution had not merely suffered from her presence. Some argued it had weaponized her departure. Palace aides declined to comment. The official channels remained quiet even as the pressure mounted. William was seen attending a veterans event in Manchester the next day, smiling stiffly for the cameras, while Kate, elegant composed, opened a new children's literacy center with her usual poised calm. The message was clear: the show goes on. But beneath the surface, another document was already being prepared, one that didn't just challenge the past, but laid bare a plan the palace never intended to reveal. The second document, quietly handed to a senior editor at The Guardian by an unnamed source, came not in the form of a leak, but as a dossier. 8 pages bound and time-stamped, marked internal use, strategic communications, Q3 2019. It was by all definitions a war plan, not against the media, not against an institution, but against a single narrative: Meghan's. Compiled by a discrete palace communications subcommittee, referred to cryptically as the Continuity Group, the report outlined a multi-phase PR strategy to protect the crown's long-term image from what it called external disruptors with internal access. Though no names were mentioned directly, the language left little doubt. The document described techniques to position loyal core figures as stabilizers, to contain emotional volatility by reinforcing legacy values, and most damning of all, to allow public perception to assign blame organically without overt directive. It was a blueprint in silence, a way to steer the storm without taking the wheel. One section detailed how public-facing engagements by senior royals, particularly William and Kate, would be amplified during key flashpoints involving the Sussexes. Another described the calculated neutrality the palace would adopt, offering no comment during controversy, yet permitting high-trust media channels to shape the narrative through anonymous sourcing and strategic rumor oxygenation. It explained everything: the silence following the Oprah interview, the absence of official support after the Netflix series, and most critically, the palace's refusal to shut down the label "most destructive royal ever." The implications were staggering. What had once seemed like mismanagement or outdated restraint now revealed itself as calibrated maneuvering. Meghan wasn't simply being left to the wolves she had been, as some began to whisper offered up. But this wasn't only about optics. The report acknowledged reputational fallout in non-core markets, referring obliquely to the US and streaming audiences, but deemed it acceptable collateral if it preserved the firm's standing within Britain and the Commonwealth. It stated narrative turbulence abroad must be tolerated if it reinforces institutional solidity at home. In Hollywood, the shock was immediate. Several high-profile names once openly aligned with the Sussexes began retreating into silence. A-list allies deleted photos, agents declined comment, and projects once in development went suspiciously quiet. For the first time since Megxit, it appeared the fallout wasn't just reputational, it was commercial. Meghan's recently teased healing video, originally scheduled for a soft launch on her media platform, was suddenly postponed. No statement was issued, but insiders suggested the delay was strategic, a recalibration in light of the dossier's exposure. It was no longer just about public sympathy. It was about avoiding appearing reactive, manipulated, or, worst of all, irrelevant. Meanwhile, the palace continued as though nothing had changed. No denials, no clarifications, just more pictures of Kate comforting schoolchildren and William shaking hands with pensioners, while the media now openly debated whether Meghan had ever stood a chance or whether she had been cast in a role from which she could never escape. And yet, despite the storm, Meghan wasn't done. A new video was already recorded, awaiting release, 10 minutes long, tightly edited, and titled "Only the Truth and the Hurt." Its contents remain sealed for now, but one palace insider warned, if she presses send, the equilibrium we fought so hard to build could crack wide open. The video dropped at 8:00 p.m. GMT without warning. No media advisory, no teaser campaign, no PR rollout. Titled simply, "The Truth and the Hurt." The 10-minute clip opened with Meghan sitting alone on a garden bench, framed by dusky twilight, speaking directly to camera. There were no graphics, no background music, just her voice, measured but tired, steady yet fractured in places. She didn't name names, didn't accuse, didn't rage. Instead, she offered a timeline, a recollection of internal requests for space moments, where she felt unheard decisions made without her knowledge, and most pointedly, the emotional toll of seeing her name attached to what she called a label engineered to erase everything else I've done. She acknowledged mistakes, admitted missteps, but also made clear no one enters this institution to destroy it. But some of us leave it because staying might destroy ourselves. The reaction was instantaneous and polarized. Supporters flooded social media with renewed calls for accountability, using hashtags like #SystemSilences and #ProtectMeghan. Prominent mental health advocates praised the vulnerability, while several public figures, some who had previously remained silent, stepped forward to express regret for not speaking up sooner. Even in mainstream newsrooms, the tone shifted slightly, less dismissive, more reflective. But not everyone was moved. Critics called the video a performance timed for maximum impact, designed to reassert control over a narrative she no longer owned. Palace loyalists dismissed the video as one-sided catharsis, accusing Meghan of reigniting wounds that had already been publicly processed and privately closed. The institution doesn't respond to every storm, one former aide told The Telegraph, because it doesn't flinch. That's its strength and its curse. And the palace, as always, no comment, no statement, no gesture, just more of the same carefully timed appearances: Kate opening a children's art center, William hosting veterans, Charles giving a speech on climate diplomacy. If they saw the video, they did not show it. If they felt its impact, they did not say so. Instead, what followed was more subtle and arguably more telling. Over the next 48 hours, several mainstream outlets began reprinting op-eds, framing Meghan's video not as revelation, but as a final act of defiance, a woman trying to rewrite a story that had already been decided. A legacy it seemed was being locked in place. And that is the enduring danger. When labels are allowed to harden into public memory, when most destructive royal ever becomes a shortcut for podcast headlines and biographies, truth becomes collateral. And in this case, the cost isn't just Meghan's reputation, it's how future outsiders will be seen judged and dismissed. Perhaps that was always the plan. So now we ask you, has Meghan been silenced, or did she lose control of the narrative by her own hand? Was the palace merely protecting its legacy or orchestrating a quiet execution of character? You decide.